Hello, everybody. I am Roger Bodee here on the Manor Podcast. I am joined with my best friend and co-host Michael Hamilton. How are you doing today, Michael?
Doing pretty good. Happy to be here.
Happy to have you. So the goal of this podcast is going to be to give very high-level and direct strategic advice when it comes to the great game of Flesh and Blood. Michael has had phenomenal results and for a while was the highest rated professional Flesh and Blood rated ELO player in the world. He's since fallen off. He didn't win a tournament for once, and he's much lower rated now, probably second or third. I haven't looked.
I'm actually in sixth now.
Oh, geez.
Yeah,
I might
how
need
the
to.
mighty have
I
fallen.
might need to look actually into getting a new co-host now. But we'll finish this one out just for the fun of it.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you'll keep me for this one.
Yeah, it'd be too much of a hassle to come up with a brand new name and everything like that. The M&R podcast, as it says there, or Manor, as we're going to call it, is for Mike and Roger. As I said at the introduction, my name is Roger Bodee. I'm also a competitive Flesh and Blood player, but I am not as accomplished as Michael Hamilton, given as I have not won or top 8'd every single calling I played in. I've only top 16 a couple and scrubbed one. So, or did I top 32 one? I don't know. I've done okay at a couple, but I'm just not as world renowned yet. But I'll get there. We'll see how France goes.
I believe.
Thanks. So, like I said before, the goal is going to be giving our takes on a week-to-week basis on what's happening in the state of Flesh and Blood, our thoughts and opinions on where the metagame sits, where it's going, and maybe even some hot takes as far as where the design levels are, what power levels are, and what players are overlooking at the current game state. So we're happy to have you, and we're looking forward to having a very successful podcast here. Okay, Michael. So I think today's topic is going to be the Pro Tour. The Pro Tour that I did not play in.
Yeah. You were at home well, not at home, at the hospital.
Yeah, at the hospital. The birth of my firstborn son was probably a bit more important, but in hindsight, it was close. It could have gone either way, considering he was delivered on Monday, so I could have played in the tournament. It would have gone just fine. My wife.
Well, actually, a lot of flights got delayed that were scheduled to come back Sunday night.
I would have booked a car. I would have been on the car plan the moment I would have seen those delays for another day or two. I'd have been like, let's just rent the shittiest car, whatever car we can get, and I'll just drive back. And if I get pulled over going 200 miles per hour on the side of the road, I'll explain the whole situation to the officer, and he'd be like, I'm sorry for pulling you over, sir. And he would have just let me go.
I'm sure.
But anyways.
Anyway.
So the Pro Tour that you played in, what did you think about it at a high level? What was your overall impression of the level of competition, how it was went for you? Just, give it to me in a nutshell.
It felt very similar to a calling. The players were good. I guess, you missed the first few rounds where some players, in callings in the first few rounds, sometimes you play against...
Axis Dorinthia?
You play against less competitive stuff some of the time. And I think there was less than that at the Pro Tour than there would be at callings. But a lot of the times, even in later day one of callings, the players you're playing against are quite good and have a pretty good understanding of their heroes and the matchups and stuff. And it felt a similar caliber of players at the Pro Tour.
That's fair. I think just given how new the game of Flesh and Blood is, it's reasonable that not everybody's going to be a crusher like you right off the bat. Some people still need to find their way and start learning the overall heuristics that make a great cardboard slinger. But it definitely makes sense that it's still a little bit higher than your average calling. And I think overall, as time moves on, callings, Pro Tours, Worlds, whatever, even your local armories, the player skill cap will keep getting higher over time. So that's definitely something for everybody to be aware of and think about as they progress.
Yeah.
But
I agree.
I'm glad you agree with that high-level assessment. So if we get into more specifics here, what hero did you play?
I played Chain. Um, I had
You played the 20 health hero?
Chain Bound by Shadows, I
Oh,
believe.
okay. That makes more sense. When I thought you were handicapping yourself by playing the young hero in constructed.
No.
Okay.
Uh, though I have heard that someone did do that at ProQuest, not at the Pro Tour.
Well, it would have been even more impressive if they would have won that Procrest. But please go on. How did Chain Bound by His Shadows do for you?
The deck performed very well. My build was a little bit different than um, the like normal traditional chain decks, I guess. Um,
Well, what in your mind is a normal traditional chain deck?
I guess Cody Williams' list from the calling is kind of my reference point. I feel like that's where a lot of people start from. I guess Pablo's is probably the default list now, and my list was quite a bit off his as well.
In what way?
Um, Mainly, I cut Shadow Puppetry and added Void Wraith.
Well, we'll just start right off the bat with there. So, cutting Shadow Puppetry. I mean, that's powerful, majestic. One of the premier cards, shadow actions that most chain players utilize in their decks. So, what was it that led you away from such a powerful and staple of the deck?
Yeah, so basically, with the non attack actions in Chain, the main reason that you're playing them is to get Go Again, because you need lots of sources of Go Again to clear your blood debt when you flip over, as you flip over multiple blood debt cards in the later shackles. But the problem I had with Shadow Puppetry specifically was early in the game when you don't flip over all those extra cards, it's not really worth spending a card to gain 1 damage and an action point. And then if you aren't wanting to play it because it's not worth a card to gain 1 damage and an action point, then it only blocks for 2. So in those aggro matchups especially, it's quite bad in the early turns.
That
And
makes
then
sense.
I was also finding that in the control matchups where you do want that effect of getting of well, the matches that go long where you want that effect of getting the extra action point. Um, Shadow Puppetry doesn't have any real way you can use it without breaking the combat chain or using creepers with it. So when the premier control deck is playing Rampart of the Ram's Head, you get punished pretty severely for breaking the combat chain.
And you don't put any merit at all for the extra card that you could potentially banish, because in Chain, that could actually be a card that you effectively have drawn for the turn, or set up for a later turn.
Yeah, I think it is. I think there is some value in it. I
But
think it's probably like worth a third of hitting with like a snatch or something where the effect is just drawing a card. Um,
all right, that makes sense. And then Void Wraith. So why such like a that's just a common clunky card, not generally something that's very impressive. So why put that card in your deck?
yeah, so as I was playing Chain, one of the best blood deck cards, in my opinion, was Ghostly Visit. You flip it over, it doesn't have any conditions to play. It's just 1 for 4. You can give it Go Again with your ability, with Chain's ability, and then it has a neat trick with Maverin Skies where you can play Maverin Skies and then make a Shackle, and then attack with Ghostly Visit, and then attack with a Runeblade card, and then attack with Rosetta Thorn. And you don't the Ghostly Visit, since it's not a Runeblade action, it doesn't use up the Maverin Skies Go Again when you do that, so you can use multiple instances of Go Again without breaking the combat chain. And I found that Void Wraith just felt like more copies of Ghostly Visit in a lot of spots, and sometimes even better, because there were quite a few turns where you just hold 1 blue or 1 blue and 1 other card going into your turn, and then you flip over a blood deck card. It was like the ideal one to hit off a 1 or 2 card hand because you could just make a shackle, play the Void Wraith, and swing Rosetta Thorn and turn a 1 card hand into 7 damage.
Okay,
On top of that, it also blocks for 3, which is
you
very
do love
important.
3 blocks.
I do.
Blocking for
Um,
3 is very high on Michael Hamilton's checklist of how he evaluates cards.
yeah, specifically in the aggro matchups as Chain, you have inevitability over the other aggro decks. As long as they can't fatigue you, then the later the game goes, the better it is for you because you're just banishing more cards, which is essentially worth drawing more cards in chain. So
So your
uh,
assessment was that just straight up Chain was the fastest, most efficient, best aggro deck in the format.
um, I wouldn't say it's the fastest because your Shackle 0, Shackle 1 turns usually are like pretty low damage output compared to most other aggro heroes. Like, I guess Briar's the main other
Yeah, that's interesting
aggressive
because
hero.
I figured you would still be on par with Briar in terms of what you're doing and how you're handling things. So I couldn't think of another hero that could potentially be faster than Chain in this meta, aside from I guess we'll get to that in a minute. The high roll Kano turns, but
Yeah. So I think you're slower than other aggro decks on low shackle counts, which is why, um, specifically why I think blocking is important because when the game goes longer, your turns are just going to be much bigger than their turns when you have the higher shackle count. So
well, you just
it's
have access to
important.
more cards, so the ability to play more cards usually converts to more damage.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
interesting. Who knew? So, anyways, so that makes sense why you picked Chain for the event. Were there any other notable differences? I know little minnowisms, pretty controversial sometimes between Chain players, specifically uh, whether the value you get off of the playing the belittle and minnowisms in your deck is worth the downside of having to shuffle your deck and re-randomize it to offset your pitch stacking. So what are your thoughts on belittle and minnowism?
Yeah, I actually think the worry about shuffling is kind of overblown. In the fatigue matchups, if you use belittle and shuffle on like the first few turns of the game, it doesn't really hurt you. You can still set up a pretty effective pitch stack for your later turns. And it's kind of like it's really difficult to set up a pitch stack from turn one anyway because you don't know how many Artivores you're going to draw. So that is going to mess up your offset anyway.
Well, not only Art of Wars, but weren't you also running Tome of Faendal?
Yes, but I did not keep it in against the fatigue decks.
All right, that makes sense. I was just pointing to other effects that potentially could skew how many cards you've drawn over the course of a game. I always thought that was one of the biggest barriers for me when I was playing Chain was effectively keeping track of just how many cards I've gone through in the deck while playing it and calculating what shackle turns are going to hit with what cycle of the deck when we're going very long with the deck. And I think it's really what separates the mediocre to good chain players from the top tier pro tour winning chains as we saw.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay. So anything else you want to say about chain before we move on to the meta as a whole for the pro tour?
I think I could talk about Chain for a really long time, so there's nothing specific that I want to get in here. So we can go ahead and move on.
Okay. So what matchup were you specifically hoping to get paired against every round in the pro tour?
Um,
What did you think your best matchup was?
Casino Starvo.
Why was that?
I just really liked the plan of being able to block, and they didn't, for being an aggressive deck, they don't actually output that much damage. A lot of their power is through their disruption, and a lot of their disruption doesn't actually stop you from like shackling and progressing your game plan. So if they hit you with even a fused Oak and Old, and then you can still make your shackle and push a few damage through, it wasn't that bad for you. And then the big turn when you had basically my game plan was setting up an Art of War plus a Belittle and having one really big turn where you push through a bunch of damage and then kind of put them on the back foot. And the turn that you want to do that, even if they came at you with a very disruptive on hit like a Spinal Crush or, like I said earlier, an Oak and Old or Crush the Weak is another one, you had the Husk to cover up like the important on hit turn.
Yeah, there's no doubt that Husk is an extremely powerful defensive option. It's basically like having your own unmovable on command just as a piece of equipment, which is pretty insane when you think about it.
Yeah, that's true.
So how many times in the Pro Tour did you get paired against Casino Starvo? At least once, I know.
It was a lot. I believe it was 8. No, 6. I think
Six.
I played against 8 Starvos and 6 of them were Casino.
Oh, and how many times did you beat your best matchup?
Uh, I only beat it 4 of the 6 times.
4 out of 6. Huh. I guess that's a pretty good win rate still. So what went wrong in the two that you lost, though?
One of them, my opponent was able to basically hold a pulse, the Ice Lightning pulse plus an Evergreen to enable Starvo every turn, and they played 4 Oakenolds while holding those 2 cards.
Wait. Did you call a judge? They're only allowed to register 3 Oakenolds in a deck, Michael. I don't know how you let that one slip by you, but
They played Pulse of Candlehold to return 2 on one of the turns. I think the 4th or their 3rd Oakenold was so they played the first 2 Oakenolds, and then on turn 2 and turn 3 they played the first 2 Oakenolds, and then on turn 4 they Pulse of Candleholded. They used Pulse of Candlehold to put the 2 Oakenolds back on top of their deck, activated Crown of Seeds to draw the Oakenold, draw the first one, and then they played that one as the 3rd Oakenold, and then the following turn they drew the 4th one. They weren't actually able to play it that following turn, so they arsenaled it, and then they played it the turn after that, and that was enough to finish me off.
oh yeah, I mean 4 Oakenolds is a lot for anybody to go through, no matter how many Carrion Husks they're playing. Maybe if you got to play 2 Carrion Husks, you probably would have been okay, but they had 4 Oakenolds, you had 1 Carrion Husk. The math checks out why you would lose that game. That still only accounts for 1 of your Casino Starvo losses. What happened to the other one? Did you get hit by 5 Oakenold 6?
No, the other one, I think I only got hit by 1 Oakenold. And it was a really tough game. It ended up kind of close, and I think I made a couple of small decisions wrong. There was one turn that they did the Starvo reveal and played the Oakenold for 11, and I was at around 30 life, I believe, and I had to choose whether to husk that or wait. And my hand wasn't that good, so if I used my husk and I came back with like a pretty medium hand, I don't think I would have been in great shape that game. So I ended up choosing not to husk it, and I didn't block because my hand was 2 reds and 2 blues, and I really wanted to make sure I had a blue in my hand because I had 1 or 2 cards in Blood Debt that I needed to clear. And I got hit by the Oakenold, so I got hit by the Oakenold, and the 2 random cards that were put on bottom were my 2 blues.
It's always how it goes. You always say, if I keep any of these cards in my hand, as long as it's not just the red or just the card that doesn't do literal anything, it'll be just fine. But it's always that one. It's always the one you don't want that you get left over. That's just how it goes.
Yeah. And then I knew they had the Pulse of the pump spell one. It's not Eisenloft.
Yeah, there's Eisenloft and Candlehold, and then there's the purpley one.
Volthaven.
Volthaven, yeah, the one Lexi's from. How could we forget everyone's favorite hero, Lexi's hometown?
So I also knew they had Pulse of Volthaven that turn that they Oakenold me, and I think that maybe should have been enough to shift my decision the other way, because the following turn, after I had my kind of weak turn, and I took a little bit of Blood Debt damage, that put me in range where when they had when they activated Starvo and just attacked for 9 with a dominated, I believe it was an Evergreen, and then they used the Pulse on the hammer for 8, I was forced to husk that turn anyway because I was going to take enough damage to put me below 13.
Okay. All right.
So
but
I think a couple of things went wrong for me that game. I didn't have any super strong hands, and then I also think that close decision I might have made the wrong choice.
Okay, it was all variance, and you got robbed. Got it. Okay. Moving on. Do we want to talk about the big, fiery, flaming elephant in the room in the form of Kano. I guess there weren't that many elephants in the room, but there were still enough that had an insane conversion rate. I believe like 4 of 7 or 5 of 7, making day 2, and then 2 into top 8. So
And a third in the top 16.
yeah. Do you feel like you could have beaten those Kano players, or do you feel like you would have had to change a couple of cards in order to have a better matchup for that consideration?
Honestly, Kano wasn't really a hero I was paying a lot of respect to in my testing. I had an even fold in my deck, which I think is a pretty powerful card in that matchup, especially against the decks that are very reliant on Wildfire, on Aether Wildfire.
It does say Arcane Barrier.
This says Spellvoid.
Oh, my bad, my bad.
And then I had a Nulrune Robe also as kind of like I had one slot that I didn't really need for any of my other matchups, and I thought there was a chance that people would bring Kano. Um, that said, I really don't know how the matchup plays out. I still haven't played against it, so
Fair enough.
I
What
don't know if I was lucky or they were lucky to not run into the matchup.
what is really interesting moving forward for pro tours or these kind of smaller events is, even if you say, well, okay, well, let's say we're playing Chain or Briar or a different, more aggressively slanted deck. Um, you could put the pieces of Arcane Barrier in your list, but as we saw with Zach against his matchup against Kano on camera over the weekend, you still might not have enough blues just because your deck just isn't very blue heavy. So if you have the Arcane Barrier but not enough resources to dump into it, it's really not helping you mitigate the oncoming inferno that is Kano.
Um, that is true. That is true. My chain deck, I guess, uh, I could have brought this up when we were talking about my chain deck specifically, but I did have a much higher blue count than I believe is typical in chainless. I was playing 25 or 26 blues into every matchup.
Well, that makes sense given that you're playing, more high cost cards like Void Wraith as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just thinking more so along the lines of like Briar, or even Lexi to an extent, where a lot of the heroes just aren't playing enough blues or resources in order to both have functional turns, and prevent the Arcane Barrier. There's a real tension between uh, using your resources to mitigate the arcane damage that just isn't present, when just through normal combat damage. Because if you're red, I can't think of a red thing that blocks for 3. Snatch only blocks for 2, but your red Snatch blocks for 2 physical defense, but it only blocks 1 arcane damage no matter what. It's a lot easier to get some defensive value out of your more aggressively slanted cards through physical damage than it is through arcane damage.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Especially with the decks that are like higher on their red counts, because um,
They just don't need the
usually
resources.
the usually the if you can't use the red, then you can just block for 3 with it. But against the arcane damage, red suddenly only block for 1, and that's only if you have the arcane barrier available too.
And ultimately, blocking for 1 isn't doing very much against Kano. I mean, blocking 1 damage out of the 45 billion trillion damage that they're throwing at you when they're comboing off isn't saving you at the end of the day.
Well,
I was rounding up a little bit, given, but
what 1 damage actually can prevent a reasonable amount of damage if you prevent 1 damage on their Aether Wildfire, and then they play 1 more attack or 1 more action that does arcane damage, followed by Blazing Aether. That 1 damage you prevented off the Aether Wildfire is actually worth 4 life. So it's
right.
not nothing.
It's not nothing, but it's not enough to. I mean, 4 life out of 30 plus damage turns still isn't exactly where you want to be. But I get what you're saying. All right. So we covered Chain and Kano now. Were there any other heroes that were surprising to you in their prevalency at the Pro Tour?
There was a reasonable amount of Prism.
Yeah, that was
Um,
really interesting to me.
and it seemed like basically all the prisms were doing different things. So it didn't seem like there was like a uniform build they all came to, but there was a lot of representation for prism.
And surprisingly, they didn't get blown out of the room either. They had a reasonable day two conversion rate, and I think a couple almost made it into top eight as well, right?
I think there was one prism in the top 8,
All right, all right. Well, I mean, even
and then I was gonna say, and then I think 10th place was also a prism, 10th or 11th.
yeah. So it's just interesting to me considering I was almost ready to just write that hero off completely at the end of the day, just because I thought it would just struggle so much into the meta, but that obviously wasn't the case. Do you think there was anything particularly that we overlooked as far as the Prism's ability to still compete in the meta?
Yeah, so I think there were a couple things. I think one, we kind of thought that Chain and Starvo would have equal shares of the metagame, and uh, that wasn't what showed up at the Pro Tour. There was significantly more Starvo than there was Chain. And then the other thing is that the Prism Chain matchup is usually quite good for Chain, but you have to really know what you're doing in the matchup. Otherwise, you risk getting fatigued um, or even heralded out if you don't block correctly against them. Because Prism kind of has the same thing as Starvo, where she can play 2 different plans against Chain, and um, if the Chain doesn't know what you're doing and makes a couple of mistakes, that matchup's not as bad for Prism as people envisioned it to be, or we specifically envisioned it to be.
That makes sense. Um, I think it's interesting also how dynamic Prism can be, where I think it's very easy to write off the Herald plan sometimes, just because it's kind of a more high variance route, and it does take away from the more consistent and traditional builds of the Aura plan. But when it's going, there's no denying how powerful and above rates the Light Illusionist Prism cards are.
They have a lot of them are both above rate, and then they have built-in go again off the Prism's weapon. Uh,
Luminaris.
Luminaris, yes.
Yeah, that one I knew.
They actually are quite strong, and then they have their pretty threatening on hit triggers too. So if you can just play your heralds and they aren't ever getting popped, you're getting a very good deal.
And then I guess we'll just swing back over, bring it full circle, and talk about Bravo, star of the show. Its continued dominance and it winning the calling at the Pro Tour over the weekend shows that maybe LSS actually should have taken more aggressive measures as far as toning it down or living legend it sooner. Do you think that would have been the right call for the weekend, or were you happy it was around?
I think I think we all wish that it would have been a little bit smaller percent of the field than it ended up being, but overall, I feel like the deck was nerfed enough that it wasn't problematically powerful. It didn't end up winning the Pro Tour, and a lot of people felt comfortable with their matchup into Starvo going into the weekend, or a lot of different heroes did. Like Prism, Chain, and Kano all seemed like they had reasonable game against Star of the Show, and I think that's like enough for a healthy metagame in my opinion.
I suppose that's fair. It still wasn't, overwhelmingly dominant as we were seeing before. It was still just an above rate tier 1 deck, but other decks were able to compete with it a little bit better.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
So after the Pro Tour, we've been seeing that, Chain has been dominating over the past couple of weeks and not star of the show anymore. So that kind of speaks to how Chain being able to just husk the more high rolly turns of Casino Starvo, what's happening per game, and then aggro them out from there, is shaping out in the meta. Do you think that's a fair assessment, or is there something still that players are overlooking?
Yeah, I still think that Chain is favored into the Starvo matchup, Husk being the main reason why. Just shutting down a big turn almost single-handedly gives Chain uh, a lot of control in the matchup, and I also think that part of it might be people are a little bit tired of playing Starvo as well, so there might be less Starvo entering ProQuest. That's just entirely speculation. I haven't looked at the data on that yet.
You haven't gone to the ProQuest and asked all the players, are you tired of Starvo?
I have not. Actually, I've been at home in bed recovering
Oh,
since I got COVID or somewhere during my New Jersey trip.
yeah. Well, I haven't been out and about either. I've been too busy changing dirty diapers, so I feel you there. Um, but I do think there's a lot of merit still to maybe Starvo's trying to shift back to. I believe there was a player named Michael Hamilton, and he won the Calling Indianapolis with a more control-y style of uh, Starvo. Do you think there's going to be more merit to going back to that more controlling style and just trying to fatigue out Jane instead of racing him?
Yeah, I think that's actually the better approach in the matchup. If your deck is built in a way that you can do that, which basically means you need to play a lot of block threes and you need to play a lot of block threes that are not non-attack actions, because if you block with a non-attack action, then it turns on chains and invert existences. Um, but I do believe that if you're playing 12 defense reactions and some of big blue the big blue guardian attacks, that you have a good shot at just fatiguing chain.
And then I guess if we just talk about the invert existences for a second, that was really only an issue because Starvo, or typically in the controlling builds, still only played Arcane Barrier 1. But given the off chance that a Kano shows up to the local meta, and still also needing the ability to sometimes block an additional source of arcane damage from Chain, do you think there's any merit to playing a second source of Arcane Barrier in the matchup? Maybe the gloves, or yeah, probably the gloves, because the shield's still too good, either version, to give up in that matchup.
Yeah, I think that's very reasonable. I think if that's an approach that you wanted to take from the fatigue side, I haven't tested it myself enough to know that if Arcane Barrier 2 is better than that 3 extra points of block you'd be giving up on your gloves, but I think it's definitely reasonable.
And there's still this weird thing that can happen with Rosetta Thorn. A few weeks ago, you told me that blew my mind. Is that if you're the control Starvo and you're looking to prevent the 2 arcane damage off of Rosetta Thorn with your 2 sources of Arcane Barrier, or with Crown and a source of Arcane Barrier, in an attempt to prevent the arcane damage for the shoes, Spellbound Creepers. Thank you very much. Rosetta Thorn can actually target any player, so a chain can just target themselves and deal 2 arcane damage to their own stupid face in order to keep their Spellbound Creepers alive for an additional turn, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's obviously not ideal for the chain player, but given just how powerful Spellbound Creepers are in the matchup, it's definitely something that I think could come up reasonably if both players were sufficiently skilled with their decks.
Yeah, it definitely is something that Chain can do, is to play around Arcane Barrier 2, or even Crown plus Barrier 1 is target themselves with the arcane damage.
But still, I think there's still merit to playing the additional source of Arcane Barrier, not only for Invert Existence, but also Rosetta Thorn and Vexing Malice. So there's actually quite a bit of instances of the higher points of arcane damage in the deck overall. And if you're going on the straight fatigue route, even just preventing those 1 or 2 extra chip damages that can happen in the early turns can go a long way to actually winning the game.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Jumping back to Invert Existence, the Chain usually uses the Invert Existences on a turn that's going to be putting out a lot of damage on top of the Invert Existences, so it's not always feasible to hold the cards in your hand to prevent the invert, even if you have the 2 Arcane Barrier. But I think the points you made about Vexing Malice and Rosetta Thorn is definitely another strong reason that you'd consider playing Nullrune 2 against Chain.
Right. Ultimately, it's do you think you'll get more than 3 damage mitigation out of the second piece of Nullrune, or the for sure 3 points of physical block you'll get with just the Mopey gloves?
Crater Fist.
Yeah, those ones. Look at you.
I've
And
played some Guardian in my days.
that you have. And I'm a little sleep deprived, so specific card names might not be my forte at the moment. But strategy, I think I still got that somewhere rattling around up here. So if you had to play in a ProQuest this weekend, what would you play?
I would play Chain Bound by Shadows.
Okay. Were there any changes you would make to your list though for a more less Pro Toury format?
I don't think so. You could look at playing a little bit more Kano tech. Um,
We haven't seen
I'm not.
Kano pop up in the ProQuest so far though.
Yeah, I think that Kano is both very hard to play and very vulnerable to uh, high Null Rune, high Spell Void. If people expect it, they can definitely tech for Kano
That's
and
fair.
cause him some issues. So I
There,
think part of its success at the Pro Tour was how unexpected it was.
that's fair. But even Kano aside, it's interesting to me that you don't think there's anything you could tech for your deck to maybe prepare for the mirror a little bit better, or do you feel sufficiently well prepared for the chain mirror?
Going into the Pro Tour, the two matchups I tested the most were Starvo and Chain. So I feel like I'm pretty happy with my configuration in both of those matchups. And I actually only played one mirror at the Pro Tour, so
Did you
I
win it?
haven't. I did,
100% win rate. Look at that.
but I haven't come up with any, or I didn't. That wasn't like enough for me to have any takeaways about things I'd want to change for the mirror.
That makes sense. If I was going to play in a ProQuest this weekend, I would probably play the more controlling version of Bravo, Star of the Show. Um, I guess my biggest concern would still be running into Prism here or there, but I think with Chain being so dominant and usually typically pretty good against the Prism builds, as long as I dodged it in the early rounds, I feel like I could, have a reasonable shot to get to a top 8 where it would be more favorable matchups for me.
Yeah, definitely. And even if you play against Prism once, you can take a loss and still make top 8 at every ProQuest.
No, I want to go undefeated. I'll only accept my PTI if I lose 0 matches, Michael. Otherwise, I'll just give it away. I'll just scoop in the finals again.
Well, that's sure a choice you can make.
I'm just that competitive, man. It's all or nothing. It's all or nothing.
Okay.
Anyways, I think that just about wraps up this podcast. I want to thank everybody for listening. Thank you for bearing with us on this first cast. It's definitely been an adventure for us, so we hope you appreciated it. Any parting words from the wonderful mind of Michael Hamilton before we go?
Yeah, thank you everybody for listening, and I look forward to next time.
Couldn't have said it better myself. See you around, everybody.
Bye.